Hello, everyone, and welcome to everyone that's joining us at this important meeting. To introduce myself, I'm Matt Wilgus from the Labour Assembly Against Austerity, and I'm pleased to be part of this event, bringing together people from the forefront of the resistance against the Tories to say workers can't wait and there must be urgent action now to tackle the deepening cost of living crisis. I'm pleased to say that over 1,000 people have registered their interest in advance of this event, and thousands more will be joining us on social media. The event could not come at a more vital time, just 1 week before Sunak's spring budget statement. We are certainly at a crossroads. It was only a few months ago it seemed that the party was over for Boris Johnson, yet there he is still in office, overseeing a disastrous fall in our rights and living standards. So we are clear here today that he still needs to go, and that at this vital time we will build the massive movements that we need to resist and defeat the whole rotten Tory ruling class offensive on our health, rights, jobs and livelihoods, and that we can help win the urgent action people need now to tackle this crisis. From the proposed NI hike to the universal credit cut to the failure to take action on our rocketing fuel bills, it is clear the Tories are the same old nasty party. They are more interested in doing the bidding of their rich backers than what is needed for people across the country. And let us not forget also that the Tories still have one of the worst and most reactionary responses in the world to the coronavirus pandemic, and are currently letting the virus rip again, whatever the consequences. And it's 100% clear that they still do not have anywhere near the agenda needed to tackle the climate emergency. They've used the pandemic to further restructure the economy in the interest of the super rich, whilst attacking our right to resist, and now an even bigger class offensive from the ruling elite against the overwhelming majority is coming. We are here today then to not only say that we mustn't let them get away with it, and that we will build the resistance, but also to say there is an alternative that puts people before corporate greed, and win that alternative. Please, as the events go on, do donate at the link provided so the Labour Assembly and Arise can continue hosting these important online events. And please also support the other campaigns and links put in the chat throughout the event, including our important Workers Can't Wait petition, which reached over 15,000 signatories today. I'm delighted now to move on to hearing from our speakers. The first of which is Rebecca Long-Bailey MP, one of the MPs who always speaks out on the Tory attacks on our living standards and for a better alternative. Welcome, Becky.
Thanks very much for having me tonight and for organising this campaign. Now, over the last few years, so many within our communities have faced an onslaught of attacks to their rights, jobs, living standards, and even their right to protest. We've seen the frankly Dickensian practice of fire and rehire. We've had the explosion of the gig economy, a shift back to the days of the dock worker turning up at the dock gates every morning, unsure as to whether they'd get work, except now people are waiting at home for their phone to ping instead. And even if you are lucky enough to have regular paid work, over half of those living in poverty are in working households. And staggeringly, 75% of children growing up in poverty lived in a household where at least one person works in one of the richest economies in the world. And if you're not happy about any of this, well, of course, there's the police bill, which will chillingly silence the right to protest. Anyone that causes what's called a serious annoyance will get up to 10 years in prison. So it's a very bleak picture, and that was all before the cost of living crisis that we currently face. Now, with that crisis, the government's proposed national insurance contributions increase are going to affect 2.5 million working households on low incomes. Inflation is expected to hit an eye-watering 7.25% in April, pushing food and everyday costs through the roof. Council tax is going up in many areas, and energy prices are expected to rise by a whopping 50%. And the government's paltry answer to this is support in the form of a £200 discount that consumers have got to pay back over 5 years, essentially loading even more debt onto the backs of people who can't afford to pay it back. Then add to this, I'm just impressing everybody tonight, I'm sorry, and you add to this the government's recently proposed benefits uplift of 3.1%. We're all like, oh, that sounds good, a benefits uplift. But when you match that against the inflation that I've just talked about, that's 7.25%, and it's probably going to go much higher than that. It's actually a dramatic benefits cut for many people. And when you take all of that bleak picture together, you've got the makings, frankly, of a poverty crisis, the scale of which that most of us will never have seen in our lifetimes. So the scale of the crisis is unprecedented, and it requires an unprecedented response. And in the short term, firstly, as a movement, we've got to support calls for cutting the rate of VAT on household energy bills. We've got to campaign for a levy, which is long overdue, a windfall tax on oil and gas companies to generate income that we can use to bring people's energy bills down. We've got to demand that the plans that were set out in our last Labour manifesto to retrofit every single home in the country and bring bills down are brought to fruition. And there must be a significant increase in universal credit to offset the soaring inflation that we're seeing, as well as increases in public sector pay and the living wage. We've got to demand a real living wage, not the government's version of a living wage. And we've also got to tax wealth at the same rate as income tax, as well as spurring on long overdue discussions, really, on a universal basic income for everybody, so that everybody has a decent income to live on. But they're obviously short-term solutions, of course. And ultimately, this rampant inequality that we're seeing, it was a deliberate political strategy. And it's going to take a deliberate political strategy to rebuild our economy so that it works in the interests of everyone, not just a select few. And that means reforming things such as corporate governance. It means encouraging alternative forms of ownership to give our communities a real stake in the wealth that they create. It means solid rights for all workers from day one, as well as sectoral collective bargaining and repealing the pernicious Trade Union Act. And fundamentally, it means addressing the long-term structural failures that privatisation of our energy market particularly has caused, by recognising that public ownership of energy and water and rail, and mail, by the way, is central to addressing the cost and energy security crisis that we're facing in our energy system. Because if our energy system was brought into public ownership, such public companies wouldn't be duty bound to prioritise huge returns for shareholders. They could invest in the system, invest in renewables, and use the financially buoyant times to build up reserves, if you like, to protect against the types of price fluctuations that we're seeing. And they get this in other countries across the world. This is a sad fact. In Germany, they get it. 2/3 of all electricity is bought there from municipally owned energy companies. They get it in France as well. 2/3 of their electricity comes from a company called EDF, which is majority owned by the French state, which also runs its grid network and generates most of the electricity. And what most people might not understand is that EDF sells electricity to us here in the UK. So if it's good enough for France, if it's good enough for Germany, why is it not good enough for us to have our own publicly owned energy companies that can generate an income for the people of the United Kingdom? So we've got the answers. That's just a little snapshot of some of the issues that we need to tackle. And you've got brilliant speakers tonight who are going to talk on a whole range of issues. We've got the ideas, we've got the answers. And I'll just finish by saying this. There's a famous saying: you can cut all the flowers, but you can't keep spring from coming. Now, change is coming, and it's up to us now to organise and to build the movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Becky. Great, as always, and so many ideas there on how we tackle the cost of living crisis. Our next speaker is Osborne MP, a long-term trade unionist and a great campaigner for working people. It's great to have you with us today, Kate.
Thanks, Matt. And good evening, comrades. Thank you to Labour Assembly Against Austerity for inviting me to this really important meeting on the cost of living crisis. This week marks a really significant moment for the Labour and trade union movement. 8 years ago, we lost Tony Benn and Bob Coe, both of whom throughout their activist and political lives played central roles in the struggles that working class face today. Tony, who as a Secretary of State for Industry and Energy, made the decision to invest in North Sea oil, and Bob, who famously coined the phrase, "if we all sit together, we can drown the bastards." We miss their wit and their wisdom and contributions today, and how they would squirm at the present economic state of Britain. The increase to the cost of living caused by rising energy prices and food costs has never been more at the forefront in the anxieties of the people in my constituency of Jarrow and of course beyond. Anxieties compounded, as reported yesterday by the TUC, that real wages have fallen by 1.5%, the worst drop in 8 years. Today's cost of living crisis has been bubbling for decades, a crisis which is a direct consequence of an economic system which regards water, energy and food as commodities rather than national assets. A policy whereby over the last 40 years, successive governments have made sure that the private sector has firmly replaced the role of the state in the name of profit, accountable to profit at the expense of the taxpayer, a direct consequence of a long-lasting neoliberal political culture that has hung over our politics for generations. A cost of living crisis which compounded by this Tory government's desire to do deals with the regimes like Saudi Arabia to offset our shortage of supplies. Domestically and overseas, the current crisis is showing the true politics and intention of this Tory government. Any means to cover their own failings, always at the expense of working and marginalised people. However, what I'd like to remind this evening's meeting is that, of course, it doesn't have to be like this. Why is it our government is all putting trust in these private companies which remain so intent on ripping people off and putting profit before people? In France, they're limiting the price of electricity to 4% and will return 100 euros to almost 6 million lower income families. Norway has subsidised household electricity bills, paying a proportion of the bill above a certain rate, 80% for the period January to March. Sweden has set aside 600 million euros to compensate families worst hit by energy prices. If other European governments can take positive actions to offset the burden on high energy costs, then why can't we? This is why, in the time of the Chancellor's spring statement, it's our role in the Labour and the trade union movement to demand our government take similar steps to alleviate this crisis. This week I wrote to the Chancellor Rissignac to demand his spring statement commits to a VAT cut on household energy bills, coupled with an extension of the warm home discount scheme, a scrap to the rise in payment of national insurance contributions, a rise in the national minimum wage for everyone, irrespective of age, an increase of benefits and state pensions by 8%, and more, of course. After the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, who turned the tide in Labour Party policy with our 2017 and 2019 manifesto, it's imperative that we keep the flame of anti-austerity politics alive at the core of our movement. This is why I'm proud to back campaigns such as Ian Byrne's Right to Food campaign and the TUC's demand that support for households should be in the form of a grant and no loan. Finally, I'd like to extend my solidarity to the victims of wars in Ukraine and Yemen. Remember that the cost of living crisis isn't on the shoulders of people escaping from war, but rests firmly with our government's loyalty to the private sector and profit. Crucial to keep in mind that in any conflict or war, directly or indirectly, it's always the workers who suffer most. I'm proud to represent a local authority which is home to a large Yemeni population, and I openly condemn Boris Johnson's decision to go cap in hand to Saudi Arabia, the profits of which will not benefit my constituents, but will rather line the pockets of these private companies. So solidarity, comrades. I'm forever grateful for rallies like this in these most testing the times for the left. And to finish, I'll ask you to reflect on the words of Bob Crow, who famously said, "If you fight, you won't always win, but if you don't fight, you will always lose." Thank you.
Thank you, Kay. And so important as well to remember both Bob and Tony this week. Our next speaker is due to be Dave Allen from the TUC Disabled Workers Committee, but he's not with us yet. So we're delighted to move on to John Hendy QC, Labour Lord, a central figure in the Institute of Employment Rights, and someone who for decades has defended working people and our trade union rights. Great to have you with us today, John.
Thanks for inviting me, Chair. Thanks, comrades. I want to speak about wages this evening. Don't mean any disrespect to those on pensions or benefits, or those who haven't got the advantage of either of them. In my professional work, I specialise in the law at work, industrial relations, workers' rights, trade union rights, and so on. But when we're talking about wages, it's important to remember that there's no right to a decent wage. There is actually an international law, but not in UK law. In fact, COVID, the experience we've had over the last 2 years, shows really how worthless the rights at work we do have actually are. Let me address that in 4 headings. First of all, health and safety. Health and safety at work, where we've got a raft of legislation protecting workers. The regulations which should have protected workers against getting COVID at work were simply unenforced. Unenforced by employers, unenforced by the health and safety executive, and ignored by the government in the guidance that they published. Key workers bore the brunt of the COVID infections, and now the government are telling employers that it's up to them what precautions they choose to take to protect workers from infection at work. Secondly, jobs. All the laws that we've got on redundancy and unfair dismissal and all the rest of it didn't protect workers from being sacked during COVID. And we all know about fire and rehire, which Becky has already mentioned. And there are other changes too, which have brought about insecurity of employment. We've had a rise now for over the last 15 years to a staggering 3 million people who are self-employed, and another 2 million people who have different forms of engagement other than being employees. Now, all those workers don't have the protection of unfair dismissal. They don't have all sorts of other protections as well, such as minimum notice periods and so on. And then let's come to hours as the third point. There are those 3 million self-employed workers, of course, don't have any guaranteed hours. Add to that another 1 million workers who are on 0 hours contracts, and an unknown number, millions probably, who are on variable hours contracts where the employer can change the hours or change the shifts. In fact, I read a report just now from the Living Wage Foundation, which suggests that 32% of British workers receive less than 1 week's notice of a change in their hours of work. And of course, there are millions of workers on part-time working, and those who are working less than a full-time job are the most likely to be on the lowest earnings. Well, then let's come to wages and income. The median wage at the moment is around £500 a week. Now, just think what that means. There's 32 million workers in this country. The median wage is the wage which half of them, less than half of them earn, which means, in short, 16 million people earn £500 a week or less. I think that's staggering. Of course, we know that the real value of wages has been stagnant since 2008. It's barely risen. It just rose a fraction before COVID struck, and now the real value is falling again. And as Becky mentioned, with inflation predicted to reach 7.6% per annum this year, the Resolution Foundation say that means that the value of the pound in your pocket is going to diminish by 7.6% by the end of the year. So the real value of the wages, of median wages, is going to fall. Add to that, we know that there are more people in work on benefit than out of work on benefit. So we've got, as Becky mentioned, millions of people living in poverty. 18 million of our 67 million people in this country live below the minimum income standard, according to the Roundtree Foundation. 9 million people live in poverty, of whom more than 4 million are children. So what's to be done? Well, first of all, we need to realize how we got to this position. And I think it's absolutely clear. If you look at the level of collective bargaining coverage, that's to say the number of workers whose terms and conditions were fixed by negotiation between employers and unions, it was between 1945 and 1980, around 85%, sometimes a couple of percent more, sometimes a couple of percent less. In fact, the 1970s was the most equal decade in British history economically. Now, the percentage of workers covered by a collective agreement is down to about 25%. And that was achieved by consistent government policies, both Tory and Labour, of abolishing the Fair Wages Resolution, which fixed public wages in the public sector to minimum collective agreements, abolishing wages councils, putting restrictions on trade unions, in particular on the right to strike. It was driven by policy determined by government to smash sector-wide collective bargains and by media pressure, again, particularly against trade unions. It was driven by globalization and outsourcing. So we have to reverse those things. We've got to, of course, drive up the national minimum wage, increase benefits and so on. But the key is to get back to sector-wide collective bargaining. So the trade unions are key in this. They have to go forward with the goals of recruitment, organisation, and insist on sector-wide collective agreements. We've done it before and we can do it again. Anybody with any knowledge of labour history knows that that was achieved over a fairly long period of time, but it was achieved by the unions organising in the workplace, and we've got to do it again. We also have to hold the Labour Party to the pledge they made at last year's conference. You recall the Employment Rights Green Paper, which is in fact a continuation, so far as workers and trade union rights are concerned, of the manifesto pledges of 2017 and 2019. But it's the trade unions rather than a political party, which I think is going to dig us out of this hole of the cost of living crisis. What we need is organisation and solidarity. And that's the message that I bring to the meeting this evening.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for that indeed, and so many important issues. And it's great to have some leading trade unionists joining us on this call today as well. I'm going to hand over quickly now to Sian Errington from the Labour Assembly Against Austerity, who's going to say a few words and action points on behalf of the organisers.
Thank you, Matt. And I think it's been referred to in other meetings that this is the bit in a virtual meeting where a virtual bucket gets passed around us all, and we're asking you for donations. I think it's, all of our speakers are highlighting today the different aspects of the cost of living crisis, and we know the past decade, and in particular the last 2 years, have been financially very difficult for very many of us. Those of us that can afford to give a little, though, and if 100 of us who can afford it could give £10, it would make a massive difference towards being able to fund the Zoom costs, the mailing list costs, and everything to keep events such as this going. Over the past few months and coming up, we've had different informative events that go into specific topics in detail. We have events such as tonight with lots of different high-profile speakers where actually we can all listen to the arguments, and it arms us up and gives us up ready to go back into CLPs, community organisations, ready to argue and fight the good fight. And that's really important. Keeping things online is really important because it enables lots of people to participate and to listen from across the country, and in some cases from around the world. But they do still have costs, just like physical meetings do. So please, those of you that can donate, please do so on the links provided in the chat box. We also want to highlight the Workers Can't Wait petition, which is a change.org petition that we've set up, which is directed at Rishi Sunak, calling on a range of measures that would definitely help people, and things that the government can absolutely do now that would make a real difference to people's lives and being able to make ends meet and to have a better life. So please do sign that. We should hopefully during today go over 15,000 signatures, so that would be awesome if we could definitely do that during the meeting. And before I disappear and hand us back to our speakers, I want to just highlight the little donate link again, which is the equivalent of me doing a last shake of the bucket as you go out the door. But please do donate, those of you that can, and thank you all so much for taking part in this event and future events.
Thank you, Sian, and it's great to have over 500 people getting up towards 1,000 with us online on Zoom and on other mediums as well. We've got people tuning in from Belfast, Cardiff, Stirling, Bristol, Tyneside, Hastings, Northampton, Islington, Sheffield, Elton, Dundee, Hull, Newcastle, Stroud, Shrewsbury, Stockport, Edinburgh, Wimbledon, Lincoln, Leeds, West, Byfleet and Hayes, and allegedly someone from Dubai. And that's good to have people from all over the world with us today. As Sian said, if you can donate, please do. I can see some of them coming in now. It does make a big difference. And we are sort of the largest online, part of the largest online left platforms now for events after these 2 years of the pandemic. And it's important to keep them going for so many people for accessibility and other reasons. Our next speaker, I'm delighted to move on to, is Nabeela, who is the Young Labour student rep. And also for people in Young Labour, the candidate that the Labour Assembly is supporting to be the next chair of Young Labour. Young Labour again and again have shown the way in recent years, and it's great to stand with them in solidarity and to have our comrade with us here today. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's really good to be with you today. So like Matt very kindly mentioned, my name is Nabeela, and I'm one of the student reps alongside Fraser Amos on Young Labour's National Committee. And I'm really proud to be standing to be chair of Young Labour. So I grew up in Sheffield, where I still live today, and the working class estate I grew up in knows the price of the cost of living crisis. So we had boarded up shops, we've had public services slashed, and when I was still in school, my youth club turned into a food bank. So we know that young people today are the largest generation of private renters in this country, the most likely to be in precarious work, and those of us who are students are loaded with thousands of pounds of debt before we even enter the full-time job market. And in a lot of ways, it does feel like our future has been stolen. But we also know that this isn't something that came out of nowhere. We know that this government has left working people out to dry, and they've been raising our taxes while slashing our living standards. But this crisis isn't inevitable. It's a product of a privatized energy company system that sort of puts our ability to live at the mercy of global market instability and warmongering. Just today, my local council had to send a letter to residents explaining that over a decade of government cuts has reduced our budget by £211 million. We all know that in the face of the pandemic, this means less support for those of us who need it most. But again, in the face of all this, young people have shown that we will organise a fight back. From joining renters' unions to organising climate strikes, young people have shown that we won't wait for a Westminster handout from this government. We know our rights, but we also know that, rights aren't always given. they are fought for and won. And like we've heard today from our brilliant speakers, young people desperately need a People's Green New Deal. We need to take energy under public ownership, we need to control prices and tackle the climate crisis. And policies such as social housing, better conditions for apprentices, a living wage and a national education system shouldn't become forgotten manifesto pledges from the last Labour leadership. They are promises that do have the potential to change the lives of so many. And Young Labour, alongside our comrades in the trade union movement, Labour Assembly Against Austerity, and community groups can and must defend socialist policy. So we will always stand with our marginalised comrades, and we will help organise young people in our workplaces, communities and town halls to raise our living standards. Because I think out of all the incredible organisers, speeches and everything that we hear all the time, I think the one thing that truly stuck with me from the Labour movement, and one of the greatest lessons, I suppose, from the Labour movement for me, is that we fight for bread, but we fight for roses too. And I hope that with our collective strength, with our collective support and all our resources, that is, the future we are building towards, that it will be a socialist one, and it will be a one where young people won't just survive, but will truly be able to exist and thrive. So thank you very much for having me today, and I look forward to organising with all of you over the next few years as we win the future we deserve.
Thank you very much, Nabeela, and be sure to check out the Socialist Future Slate in the Young Labour and Labour Student Selections website, and give them the support you need. As I said, Labour Assembly is very proud to support that slate, and also support Jess Barnard, the current chair of Young Labour, in her bid to come on the Labour NEC, which I think would be fantastic. As I said, it's great to have speakers today from concrete struggles against the Tory government, and our next speaker is the branch president of the UCU Open University branch, Caitlin Adams, and we're telling us about some of their ongoing campaigns and disputes that we must get behind. Caitlin, thank you for taking the time to be with us, and great to see you.
Oh, thank you so much for the opportunity. And it's a fantastic chance to follow the previous speaker, who was so inspiring about what young people and learners of all ages really deserve and what we need to build. I will say just a little bit about further education and the disputes going on there, and then turn to higher education and the Open University. Further education first, it's worth saying that pay there has fallen behind inflation by 35%. Over the last number of years, and further education staff now earn on average £9,000 less than teachers, and at the same time, of course, workload and stress have absolutely soared. This is a direct result of the loss of national pay bargaining and the failure of successive governments to take further education seriously and fund it properly. There have been some amazing local successes on this, but this year UCU is taking a new campaign across England. It's only just launched. There's a consultative ballot over pay and conditions for members all across the sector in England, and we're asking everyone to lend their support. We simply cannot allow the destruction in further education to continue as it has. Turning to higher education, there are two enormous battles over pay, pensions, and working conditions. And these are all linked very closely together. My branch is involved in both. These are fundamentally part of a broader fight back against the bureaucratization of education, through which banks and management consultants are in the process of vandalizing higher education institutions in this country. Humanities subjects and academic freedom are under attack, along with working conditions. At Leicester University, for example, we recently saw that staff were sacked on the basis of the journals that they chose to publish in. So as I said, our branch, the Open University, is involved in both of these disputes. We've taken 15 days of strike action so far this year. We'll be starting another 7 from Monday, the 21st. And we have actually done a few more days of action than other institutions because we include the weekends. So many of our tutorials and and day schools are at the weekends. So the first of our disputes, which is also known as the 4 fights, is about pay, equality, workload, and job security. Headline pay has fallen behind inflation by 25% for university staff since 2009, while workload pressures have dramatically increased. This was true even before COVID, which of course made a terrible situation so much worse. And in relation to that, last year we were offered 0% as our pay offer, and this year we've been offered 1.5%. Around half of teaching staff in universities are on temporary or non-standard contracts. 68% of research staff are on fixed terms only. Casual contracts, of course, means multiple jobs. It means gaps between appointments, moving cross-country perhaps every year or 2 years. In a recent survey, more than 80% of academic staff reported that a combination of these unsafe workloads and anxiety over temporary status was driving them to seek help for mental health issues. At the Open University, we support some of the most vulnerable learners, and our own tutors as well average about £12,000 a year. Inequality is a central and really fully entrenched feature of higher education now, with a gender pay gap of 15.1% nationally and figures of 20 or even 26% seen in some Russell Group universities. The gap between Black staff and white staff is even greater at 17% on average, and there is also a terrible gap for disabled staff. Universities have had years, plus of course they have all the necessary data and the expertise to address this, but they have comprehensively failed to do so. And that's why, as part of our 4 fights, we're demanding national frameworks and action plans to address these pay gaps, along with job insecurity and excessive workloads. For too long, universities have served as exploitation machines through job insecurity and unsafe workloads, and also while piling massive debt onto students. And in that connection, we've been very grateful to the National Union of Students, which has drawn the lines between all of these various things and between staff working conditions and student learning conditions, and has given its support to the strikes. Turning now just to pensions, this is an area that really no comedian could make up. The University Superannuation Scheme, or USS, insisted on undertaking a voluntary valuation in March of 2020, which was during the worst volatility in the pandemic. This produced a so-called deficit estimated at being as much as £17 billion. Since that time, since March 2020, according to documents from USS itself, the fund has not just completely recovered, but in fact gained almost 30 billion in value. And that's the deficit figure has nearly disappeared, even if you apply a set of really discredited and overly pessimistic assumptions. By any reasonable measure, this pension fund is in a very healthy surplus, able to pay out benefits without difficulty for the next 3 decades. Yet contrary to any evidence, USS insists a new valuation would produce the same results. And working very closely with employers, it now plans to implement dramatic cuts in order to pay for this non-existent deficit. A UCU stopgap proposal for a new valuation, which was actually approved by the USS trustees, was in fact rejected by employers. So we are in a situation where on the 1st of April, we are expecting to see implemented an average loss of 35% of our pensions. And obviously the worst impact of this would be on newer and younger staff. Part-time staff who already have much smaller pension expectations will see those shrink from tiny to nothing. What some may not realize is that during COVID, after the initial uncertainty, many universities made surpluses. The Open University, for example, had a surplus last year of £52 million. The money is there to support staff, improve conditions, and maintain our decent pensions with a good valuation. And I have to say, in relation to our local situation, the Open University prides itself on its values and its mission for fairness, equality, and social justice. But recently, its leadership acquiesced in these massive cuts to pension entitlement for all its university staff on the basis of this ludicrous valuation that was done during the worst of the pandemic. And so for us, this is an absolutely stark contradiction to those values of fairness, equality, and social justice. We'll be back on strike next week to say that these conditions, these cuts, and these pressures are simply wrong. It is pretty shameful that we are forced to fight for basic fairness, decency, equality, and basic dignity in old age. But this is the fight of our lives to defend education and defend staff, and we are asking for your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin, and we stand with you in your struggle. People might have noticed in the chat we have a message from Joe Grady, the UCU General Secretary, who was due to join us, but has urgent union business. I'm just going to read out a couple of paragraphs from it. From Joe Grady, it says, "Sorry I can't be with you this evening. We are busy preparing for strikes at 67 universities across the country, kicking off on Monday. Our members have been forced to take major strike action every year since 2018. as employers continue to push through devastating cuts to pensions and pay and refuse to address the scourge of precarious employment. Our members are fighting for their livelihoods and the future of higher education. As we face this cost of living crisis, we know our struggle is part of a wider one, and as a trade union movement, we must organise to ensure workers aren't made pay for crisis they didn't create. Thanks, Caitlin, for that speech, and thanks, Joe, for that message. Our next speaker is another fighting leader of a fighting socialist trade union. It's great to have Sarah Woolley from BFAWU with us today.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. And if I can, I want to use my contribution time to talk about the sharp end of the cost of living crisis, the reality for a group of workers up in Scotland, many of who are Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union members, that have been horrendously let down by their now ex-employer in a legal loophole that has protected him but left them penniless. At the end of last year, redundancy talks started at one of our branches. Nothing out of the ordinary there, you may say, especially after the last couple of years. It seemed to be going okay for redundancy talks, with enhancements negotiated and talks of resettlement packages for those who could or would want to be able to continue to work for the company at their other site in Arbroath. Then out of the blue, on the 28th of February, administrators took over the Dawnfresh factory in Uddingston, Scotland. There were staff in that day working overtime who were told partway through that shift to go home and informed that they wouldn't be receiving their wages that Friday. Now, people don't work overtime for the fun or the joy of it. They work overtime shifts because there is a need for extra wages. And we know as the cost of living continues to rise, for those in the food sector who are predominantly low paid, more and more of our members will be battling for overtime shifts to help them make ends meet and scrape by. Those workers at Dawnfresh have worked hard through the pandemic, processing some of the best seafood in the world. They're low paid, weekly paid workers. Many have partners and grown-up children working in the factory. And overnight, they've been plunged into a position where they have no wages coming in that week or going forwards, with no way of having been able to prepare for that situation, and absolutely no idea of when they would receive the monies owed to them, or whether they would be able to get a new job quick enough to stop them from losing their home or falling into irreversible debt. We were told by some of them a few days after the closure that they'd been forced into going to their local food banks as they live week to week on the wages they earn. And as their wages hadn't come in, they couldn't even go food shopping and really didn't know how they were going to survive. This is all bad enough on its own, but the owner of Dawnfresh is one of the richest men in Scotland, a billionaire, a multi-billionaire, who has made sure his expensive paintings were taken out of the factory before the administrators went in, so they weren't frozen as assets, who didn't think twice about plunging the very people who have worked hard for him for the many, many years in some cases into absolute poverty, rather than going through with his promises through the redundancy process and paying them what they were owed. It makes my blood boil, and that's the most diplomatic way I can put it without swearing. This just goes to show, though, the stark difference between the working class people who have kept the nation fed in our members' case over the last 2 years, told they are key workers and in receipt of claps for it, and the elite billionaires who have got richer off the back of them and literally get away with pulling the rug out from under workers' feet without a second thought, leaving them in absolute poverty. It's absolutely disgusting that a billionaire can take the easy way out, resolve themselves of their responsibility of paying workers what they are owed after months and months of negotiations, make sure they're able to protect their own wealth, and leave those workers without even enough money to go get a food shopping. We've got a choice to make right now, everybody that's watching this, as we face further increases in energy prices, fuel and national insurance contributions, not to mention food and every other everyday cost of living rise. Do we continue to let the rich get richer whilst we're forced into paying back rebates on energy bills that we've not asked for? Seeing our friends and our colleagues rely more and more on food banks and struggling to survive as terms and conditions are strict in favour of increases in profits? Or do we say no more? Do we remember that collectively we are powerful, and it doesn't matter whether you're a food operative, a teacher or a public sector worker, that we as a class really are in this all together? And only by standing shoulder to shoulder in solidarity collectively can we drive the change that we need in order for our members and our communities to thrive. Because as I've said on many platforms, We can't rely on the government to do the right thing. They've shown time and time again they are more interested in parties and giving their rich friends more money on the back of our struggle, as has been highlighted in the last few weeks with the situation faced by our members at Dawnfresh. It's scary and we're tired after the last couple of years and everything COVID and the fallout has thrown at us, on top of over a decade of austerity and the ever-rising cost of living. But we've got to dig deep and make a stand. We need to take inspiration from members in the likes of UCU, RMT and all the other members who are balloting and taking industrial action, and follow the lead of PCS, consulting their members on what action they're willing to take to fight back and work together. Because we all know it wasn't the millionaires and the bankers and the elite that have got us through this pandemic. It was teachers, public sector workers, posties, food manufacturers, tube and rail, NHS and retail staff, and the many other key workers that were celebrated but are now struggling to make ends meet. And we shouldn't be left footing the bill for the government's mistakes and mishandlings. We've got to stand together. We've got to build our movement together, support and empower each other so that workers like our members from Dawnfresh aren't left out in the cold again in a legal loophole that protects the billionaire and plunges the low-paid workers into poverty. Solidarity.
Thank you, Sarah, as ever. What a strong and important message, and well done on everything your union does. Some people in the Labour Party didn't appreciate the role of the Bakers Union, but we certainly do, and we always have Sarah and her comrades on our platforms and will continue doing so. Thank you to everyone who has donated. I can see them coming in on my screen, but we could definitely do with some more. So if you can give £10 or what you can afford at the link provided, that would be much appreciated. As I said, the costs of organising these meetings are quite high, especially as we've got much bigger than we were at the start of it. Everything we do is costing more than it used to, like the Zoom and the email list and so on, as we've got so much bigger. So please do give us your support. Our next speaker is Zita Holbourne from Black Activists Rising Against the Cuts, and also a prominent trade unionist that many of you would have seen elsewhere. Zita, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everybody who's attending. Barrack UK, Black Activists Rising Against Cuts, was established in 2010 to campaign on what we anticipated to be disproportionate impacts of the cuts and austerity on Black and Brown and migrant communities. And we've had to fight that ever since because it hasn't gone away. But that's gone hand in hand with deepening racism and deepening injustice that's faced by our communities. We've had over 10 years of cuts and austerity, and this has caused hardship and disproportionately impacted on the poorest, which means in turn that the hardest hit are Black and Brown people, migrant people, women, disabled people, older and younger people, and with a knock-on impact on the children of those households, families and communities. 10 years of austerity, 2 years of a pandemic, now the war in Ukraine. These have all come all on top of each other. And then with the rise in fuel, groceries, pay freezes, precarious work increasing, job cuts, people who were already struggling to make ends meet for over 10 years, struggling to keep their heads above water, cannot survive with any further cuts. And further rises in the cost of living. 23 million people are already hit hard by poverty and had to cut back on food and heating and make decisions between food and heat, actually. The UK has one of the highest rates of child poverty. And if a child in your household is in poverty, this impacts on their whole life. It impacts on their ability to study, to live, their life chances, and then their future as well. Many poor families have, for many years, had to survive on food banks and school breakfast clubs just to be able to feed their children in the first place. Those already face the most discrimination in society and the most discrimination in the labour market also face poverty, deprivation, poor housing, precarious work as a result of that. It's the reason why Black, Brown, disabled and older people died disproportionately from COVID. There's already a race and a gender pay gap, which should have been closed decades ago, but continues and increases. And if you meet the intersect between race and gender, you face a double impact as a Black woman. Intersectionality means multiple deepening adverse impacts, not just one issue, but a pile-up of issues. During the pandemic, it was Black, brown, and migrant workers who were the first to lose their jobs and less likely to be furloughed than anybody else. And that's because they were disproportionately in those frontline jobs, keeping essential services running, but also in precarious work with no job security and worse terms and conditions, as well as lower pay. And they're in that precarious work because of racism and xenophobia. 1/5 of adults have no savings, and 4 in 5 Black families have less than £1,500 savings. 500,000 have no savings at all. And whilst facing cuts in income of 1,200 per household, that means there's nothing left for them to fall back on. Twice as many Black people are unemployed when compared to white people, and Bangladeshi and Pakistani people have the lowest rate of hourly pay. And 1/5 of adults across the board have no savings at all. But we shouldn't forget that in times of austerity and cuts, racism and xenophobia increase, fascism increases. And that means that Black and migrant communities are scapegoated. So for poverty, for racism to end, poverty must end. And for poverty to end, racism must end. They go hand in hand. So we can't fight one without the other. And the same applies to other equality groups that are disproportionately impacted, that face discrimination in society. We need equity in the labour market. We need equal access to education, to jobs, to safe and affordable housing. And so we have to mobilise, and we can't leave anybody behind. We have to fight for those who are hardest hit. We have to fight for everybody. And we have to amplify the voices of those who are going to be hit the hardest. And we have to work together and organise and mobilise going forward. We can't afford, we can't go through any more of this. We've been through too much already. People have hit rock bottom. It's impacting on mental health. It's impacting on life chances. And it's impacting on the next generation. But actually, we deserve equality and dignity and the ability to live in our lifetime, not just for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Zita. Such an important contribution. And so many things we need to take away then. Also, people may know this Saturday, there's the UN Anti-Racism Day protest in London, and I think Glasgow as well. So please do join them. And please also support the work Barak is doing. Our next speaker is on the issues facing the NHS at the moment. Great comrade, John Lister.
Oh, thank you. Hello. Yeah, the NHS is the country's biggest employer, and it's part of the social wage of every working person and their family. And it's now short of about 93,000 staff, and it's put its frontline staff through all kinds of trauma in the past 2 years, leaving them understaffed, underfunded to face the COVID pandemic. And now NHS staff are being asked to make another heroic effort to help clear the backlog that grew during the lockdown months. The waiting list is now above 6 million and forecast to rise for 2 more years at least. There's a Public Accounts Committee report out today which blames the government for years of decline in the NHS's cancer and elective care waiting time performance. And it goes on, it says, even before the pandemic, the government did not increase capacity sufficiently to meet growing demand. The NHS has not met the 8 key standards for cancer care since 2014. Ministers now want staff to deliver more services, but they're not willing to spend enough money to expand the NHS capacity or pay NHS staff properly. After a decade and more of real terms pay cuts, Ministers' proposal for this year is a 2 to 3% increase, way below the current level of inflation. Sajid Javid last week claimed the government was at a crossroads, a point where we must choose between endlessly putting in more money or reforming how we do healthcare. Well, I would opt for the cash every time. I'm sure you would too. But it's no surprise that Javid doesn't agree. He wants more of what he calls reforms. Even before the health and care bill is on the statute book, he wants more changes. So it's no surprise that none of the reforms he proposes solve any of the big problems facing the NHS. He talks about personalised care, which can't be done without enough staff. Personal health budgets, which need more funds, more support, and suitable services for people to buy. His big idea is the right to choose which hospital to go to for elective care. But this is already in the NHS constitution, has been for a long time. It's cold comfort to an older patient in Birmingham, for example, with the country's longest waiting list, to be told they have to compete with millions of other patients who are also facing long delays in the hope of securing a quicker operation somewhere the delays are shorter. Patients want timely access to good quality care where they are, not to spend weeks trawling the internet and then, if they're lucky, trek 100 miles or so to a hospital for surgery and find their own way back afterwards. This is not even new. It's the same old nonsense we were told with Margaret Thatcher's internal market reforms back in 1990 and 91. It's the same old nonsense that got New Labour wasting billions building up a private sector. It's the same old tosh we had in Andrew Lansley's Act in 2012. It doesn't expand the beds available or the staff to look after patients. It doesn't work even when there's money in the pot. And right now we know there's not enough. Real terms Tory cuts in spending every year since 2010 have left an enormous financial hole to fill. That's why SOS NHS is calling out the government's deliberate underfunding, which they're now using in every plan that comes forward as justification for ever greater spending on private hospitals and private providers. Spending on private providers went up a staggering 26% in 2020. That's £2.5 billion in a year as contracts were signed with private hospitals. These hospitals profited huge profits, while 5,000 NHS beds remained unused and have remained unused since March 2020 for lack of cash to remodel wards and buildings. So we're calling for emergency funding of £20 billion as a one-off down payment to kickstart a revival of the NHS, and for every pound of that to be spent on NHS provision. It would allow the NHS to invest in restoring and expanding capacity, repairing and rebuilding dilapidated hospitals, replacing clapped out equipment, reopening those 5,000 acute beds, investing in mental health with new buildings and staff. It would fully fund last year's miserable 3% pay award and fund a decent real terms pay increase to help retain staff and recruit the new staff that we need to build the NHS we want. Of course, Rishi Sunak will claim it's unaffordable. Well, you know that's not true. We know Sunak happily threw £47 billion into bounce back loans during the pandemic and isn't at all bothered that more than half of it seems to be either stolen or lost. We know there are ways of raising that money without taxing working people and the poor. We need to give the NHS staff hope now that things will get better. We need to convince patients and the public that the NHS can recover. SOS NHS was initiated by Health Campaigns Together and emerged this year as a new alliance leading the fight on these questions. We're now backed by 51 trade unions and other organisations. Our petition at sosnhs.org, to be handed into Downing Street next week on the eve of the budget, has 116 signatures, 116,000 signatures so far. Our day of action on February the 26th at 85 local events across the country. We will be keeping up and stepping up the fight because we can't afford not to. We've only got one NHS. We've all only got one NHS, and it's the only way we can get emergency care when we need it. It's time for us now to fight for its life. So even if we can't kick it out right now, let's keep kicking this corrupt, despicable government until we get another U-turn from them. 20 billion now, SOS NHS, keep our NHS public. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That was great. And next, and such an important campaign, please do sign a petition. Our next speaker is Kat Hobbs from We Own It.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here tonight. So I'm Kat, I'm from We Own It. We campaign for public ownership. So we support the Workers Can't Wait petition's demand to stop the corporate rip-off public ownership of energy, water, transport and mail to bring bills down and end fuel poverty. Privatisation is making the cost of living crisis worse. We're being ripped off through our bills, we're being ripped off through our taxes because privatisation costs so much more. And public ownership has always been incredibly popular because people believe that the money we spend should be reinvested back into our public services rather than leaking out to shareholders. So today I'm going to suggest to you 3 campaigns that you can get involved with right now to help with the cost of living crisis. 2 of them are ours. The third is the SOS NHS campaign that John Lister has talked about, but I want to give it another push. I know it's a really difficult time right now. And I think it's really important that we have really specific actions we can take to try to improve things. So I'm going to talk about energy, buses and the NHS. So on energy, as Rebecca Long-Bailey explained, we are in a situation where our bills are going to be up to possibly £3,000 a year, 8.5 million people at risk of being unable to heat their homes. It doesn't have to be this way. We've put together a petition of 4 demands to Rishi Sunak and Kwasi Kwarteng, and we're calling for a public commitment by the 1st of April. Of course, they're probably not going to go along with this, but we need to make the most of this issue because it's only going to get bigger and bigger. And we have solutions on the left. We need to be talking about them, shouting about them, making the case for them, and creating as much space as possible for a windfall tax, for drastic action to help people pay their bills. So the 4 things we're calling for are a permanent windfall tax on oil and gas companies like Shell and BP at the same rate as Norway. For every £100 that Norway collects in tax, we only collect £8. We're calling for a new state-owned renewable energy company. Other countries like Norway and Denmark do this. We should do the same. We're calling for the national grid and regional distribution companies, which take the energy from the power stations to your home. We're calling for them to be brought back into public ownership. Right now, that's a private monopoly. And it would save £3.7 billion if we brought those monopolies back into public hands. That's money that could be used to bring down bills. And as Rebecca Long-Bailey mentioned, we're calling for a new publicly owned energy supplier. France has this, and EDF is making sure that bills don't go up more than 4%, which is a stark contrast to the situation that we're facing here in the UK. So 4 steps, taking back our energy, and I'm going to share that petition in the chat once I've finished. Next stop, buses. So we've had a lot of talk from the government about levelling up on buses, but what we're seeing in practice is bus cuts and bus fares going up. Bus fares in England have gone up 71% since 2005. This really affects people's lives, and public transport is part of the cost of living crisis that we're facing. We need proper funding, we need public control, and we need public ownership. Lots of you will have seen that there was a victory on this last week in Greater Manchester. We set up the campaign Better Buses for Greater Manchester, which has helped lead to Andy Burnham committing to public control. They've had a win in court last week against the bus companies, which means that he can go ahead with taking Manchester's buses into public control, which means that the profit margins of those bus companies will be drastically reduced and the network can be run for people rather than for profit. Liverpool and West Yorkshire have also committed to public control, so there's lots of really positive news for buses. But in England, it is illegal for councils to set up their own publicly owned bus company. So there are 9 municipal bus companies that managed to survive Thatcher. Reading Buses is one of them. And what these bus companies can do is they can invest back into the network because they're not spending money on shareholders. So Reading Buses invests an additional £3 million a year into improving services because it's not spending money on shareholders. So yesterday, it was the 1-year anniversary of the government's bus strategy, Bus Back Better. They've promised to review this ban on publicly owned bus companies. So we have an opportunity right now to say, if you're serious about levelling up, you will let us run buses for people, not profit. So again, I will share the petition for that campaign in the chat. And then thirdly, our NHS, as John Lister has said, it has been underfunded and privatised for the last 10 years. And what that means for the cost of living crisis is that people are either not getting the care that they need, or they're being forced to go private, getting into debt, scraping by, using their hard-earned savings. There is plenty of money. £100 billion has gone to the private sector in the last 10 years on private sector contracts in the NHS. £37 billion was splashed out on test and trace, which was privatised, which didn't work. And now we've got a crisis of staffing, crumbling hospitals. It doesn't have to be this way. So We Own It is really proud to be backing the SOS NHS campaign, calling for £20 billion in the budget next week. The NHS should be there for everyone when we need it, and we really, really support this campaign. this is a budget where Rishi Sunak could make a decision that would actually benefit patients and the public and our NHS and workers. So please do sign that campaign and join that campaign as well. And I will share those 3 campaigns in the chat. Solidarity.
Forgot to unmute myself there. One of the 2 years in, and I'm still forgetting to unmute myself. Please do support those important petitions and campaigns Kat mentioned, and thanks, Kat, to the UNIT for all the work you're doing. Obviously, when the government talked a lot for a while about taking back control, but on things like transport and energy, they seem to want to do anything but take control. Our next speaker is from the People's Assembly Against Austerity movement. Please do make sure to follow the People's Assembly on social media, and also to support their upcoming day of action on the cost of living crisis in April. Our next speaker is Helen O'Connor. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Matt. And in times of crisis, workers are constantly told that they have to bear the burden. They're the ones who have to pay. They are the ones who have to make sacrifices. These crises are caused by the profit system and the ruling class. And one thing is for sure, they never let a good crisis go to waste. And while working people and their families are expected to take the hit, you can be sure that those asking them to do so will not suffer and will in fact rake in the profits. And you won't see Kwasi Kwarteng suffer as he tells the media that working class people are prepared to suffer and make sacrifices for the Ukraine crisis. When the post-war economic upswing ended in the 1970s, workers were told to tighten their belts. And it's worth remembering that the first cuts brought in then, the attacks on living standards, caused division in the labour and the trade union movement, which paved the way for Thatcher's victory in 1979. The reason I pose it this way is to make a fundamental point. When we as a movement accept the logic that it is our union members and our class who have to tighten our belts, we're making 2 mistakes. The first is we're accepting the premise that their crisis is our responsibility and that somehow working class people are equally to blame. But secondly, and in a sense more importantly, we are refusing to give an alternative to the chaos and the instability of capitalism. And to put that bluntly, that's a mistake. So let's give a concrete example. The other week in Prime Minister's Question Time, Keir Starmer demanded correctly that the big energy companies who are making super profits and who have stated publicly that they've more money than they know what to do with should pay a windfall tax. Boris Johnson replied, this would only lead to increases in prices and would restrict the oil companies' efforts in producing green alternatives. Here, Keir Starmer had an open goal to speak to the British public. All he needed to say was, OK, then, let's not have a windfall tax. Let's just nationalise the lot. And socialists condemn imperialism, all invasions. We condemn them all. We do not pick and choose. But we now have a narrative developing that British workers will have to suffer for the crisis in Ukraine. The massive increase in the use of food banks, the appalling rise in child poverty, the homelessness crisis, the NHS and our public services being cut to the bone and privatised out of existence, attacks on free speech, the disastrous responses to the pandemic that led to hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths, and the looting of public finances to enrich the friends and families of Tory ministers all happened before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So let's be absolutely clear. We do not allow these people who own and control everything to do what they always do, to use a crisis to attack our class and to ask us to wait for the wage rises, the sick pay, and the fair treatment that we deserve from employers. No, we demand things right now, and we do not move away from these demands. Workers can't wait. They're rising up everywhere via their trade unions. They're winning big pay rises, sick pay, and they're even kicking private companies out of public services, and quite rightly so. If the political will is there, a rich country like ours should be able to ensure that working class people enjoy the fruits of our hard work, and there should be investment in the next generation that puts a stop to millions of kids growing up in poverty. And this government should take all steps necessary to ensure that the old, the sick, the disabled have the safety net and the security they need to live dignified lives. And these are the demands necessary from the spring budget, a society that works for the many and not just the few. And history tells us that we can make gains, but working class people make these gains when they fight back. These gains are never won easily. And the society we need to fight for will be won by people rising up. So my call to you is to join a trade union if you're not in one, join a local People's Assembly group, start organising widely and deeply. We all know what we need to do, and we need to play a part for our own sakes and the sakes of the next generations of solidarity.
Thank you, Helen. That was a great call to action, and please do support the People's Assembly, including the National Day of Action. There should be information on the chat. And also, just to say, hundreds of people have signed the Workers Can't Wait petition whilst this meeting's been going on. So we're over 15,000 now. So please keep sharing that and adding your name to that. And let's try and get to 20,000 before the spring statement. Our next speaker is Gemma Bolton from the Labour NEC. We're delighted to support Gemma in her bid for re-election, along with Yasmin Dow and Mishra Rahman, and also to support Jess Barnard in her bid to be on the NEC. Thanks for being with us today, Gemma.
Thanks so much for having me, Matt. And this important event has been called tonight because we're in the middle of a deepening cost of living crisis. And yet the Tories are more interested in doing the bidding of their rich banker mates than saving jobs and lives and livelihoods. So I'm going to use my short speech to lay out some of what I think is an urgent action that we need, including some of the key points that the Workers Can't Wait petition had in it. And these are the kind of radical and popular policies Labour needs to be advocating for much more strongly. And one thing the government urgently needs to do is to put more money into the pockets of those who need it most. And how can we do this? And firstly, the national minimum wage needs to be raised to £15 an hour. And the government could give the pay rise the public sector workers have been asking for. Alongside this, as COVID cases rise again, there must be increased statutory sick pay now for all. And they must urgently reverse the disgraceful universal credit cut and extend the uplift of legacy benefits. I think it's a disgrace that people are having to choose currently between heating and eating, and we need as a country to guarantee both. The right to food needs to be enshrined into law with universal free school meals for all year and a national food service. And the corporate rip-off of energy bills must end. We need a windfall tax now on the super profits and get them into control through public ownership. And whilst Keir Starmer might deny it, it is Labour's democratically agreed and popular policy to bring water, transport and mail into public ownership. And the time has come for publicly owned free broadband. All this and more should be part of a people's plan of investment in a better future with full employment, reversing austerity for good, and put a Green New Deal as part of this people's plan for jobs and livelihoods. And all of this is possible with the political will, and Labour needs to force the Tories out and put forward this kind of agenda to both win and to transform people's lives. So as James Connolly said, our demands are most moderate. We only want the earth. For people on planet, let's build a massive socialist resistance to the Tories and keep fighting for socialist change. Solidarity.
Thank you, Gemma, for that great speech, and let's keep fighting for socialist change. Thank you also, I know I keep going on about this, but it is important. Thank you to everyone who is donating. If you can give £10 what you afford, it does make a big difference. We're on the last straight now, 2 more speakers. Our next speaker needs little introduction to many of you. She is a real fighter, someone who highlights injustice and inequality in so many ways, and wrote such an important Guardian article about institutional racism just earlier today. It's a pleasure to introduce Diane Abbott.
Thank you, Matt. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, you've had some amazing speeches this evening, and I just wanted, in a way, to stress some of the points people have already heard. And of course, the main point of this meeting is that we are in a cost of living crisis, and it is going to get much, much worse. And it's going to hit the poorest and most vulnerable the worst. And I think that a lot of ordinary working people who either didn't vote or, God forbid, voted for Boris Johnson are going to see, as this cost of living crisis continues, that actually the Tories don't have their best interests at heart, have never had their best interests at heart. And I think as the crisis deepens, people are going to be looking for answers. And I believe that those of us in the labour movement and in trade unions, we do have the answers. I just want to touch on what you've already heard about the causes of the cost of living crisis, just because some people might want to give some false reasons. First of all, one of the causes of the cost of living crisis is the government's catastrophic handling of the COVID crisis, which has caused huge economic disruption. I mean, Boris, for his own purposes, trying to pose like the man that conquered COVID. Actually, he hasn't conquered COVID. And because of his policies, unnecessary numbers of people have died. Other countries have taken a better zero COVID approach, like New Zealand. If you take account of population, you are 120 times more likely to die of COVID here in the UK than in New Zealand. But Boris doesn't really care about the ordinary British public. It suits him in the short term to pose as the person that conquered COVID. So we're going to continue having this propaganda about Freedom Day and all the rest of it, whilst people are still dying from COVID. The other cause of the cost of living crisis is Brexit. I mean, Brexit was always going to be damaging economically, and it continues to be so. There's also incredible economic disruption caused by Brexit. Because of Brexit, the practicalities of Brexit, but also the awful outpouring of xenophobia that came along with Brexit, about 200,000 people left this country and went back home to their EU countries. But this hasn't caused rising wages, as some pro-Brexit people claim. It's causing labour shortages, goods and service shortages, and the scarcity has caused prices to rise and therefore contributed to the cost of living crisis. Brexit has caused shortages of key workers like HGV drivers. So the shortages and higher prices do come back to Brexit. But the other cause of the cost of living crisis is government policy, its tax and spend policies, but also its energy policy, which followed privatisation with deregulation. As we've got a situation where Shell and BP are making record profits, but increasingly ordinary people can't afford to pay their fuel bills. This is a result of government policy, government deregulation, and government pandering to global businesses like BP and Shell. And finally, another reason why we're going to have a worsening cost of living crisis is the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is going to affect global commodities prices like wheat, like oil, like it will affect everything. The other thing to say about the causes of the cost of living crisis is, apart from the things I've tried to set out, there's the government itself privatising utilities like electricity, letting them operate as free marketeers. But of course, these privatised utilities are not really monopolies, and the government has let them get away with not investing. And so we have the disastrous rise in energy prices, which other governments are acting on, but not us. The government have also lowered living standards directly with the rise in national insurance contributions, the effective rise in income tax thresholds, and the same for student loan repayments. It was the government that cut people's pay to 80% during furlough, and it's the government that allows fire and rehire. And this is the government that has cut universal credit, and they did it at the same time as cutting tax rate for bankers and big companies. So the cost of living crisis is with us and is going to get much worse. It's largely as a consequence of government policies. The price rises that have begun are going to get much worse. And I should also say, we meet at a time of war, the war in Ukraine. As I said, we don't know how that's going to end, but we do know already there's a clamour for more spending on the military, more spending on defence, at exactly the same time as the Tory Chancellor of the Exchequer wants big cuts in public spending on services and social welfare. We must say no to this and demand that the government's priority is welfare, not warfare, nurses, not nukes, jobs, not bombs. This cost of living crisis is coming towards us at increasing speed, and I believe that only the left have the analysis and the answers. Thank you all very much for coming to this meeting, and thank you very much, the organisers, for inviting me to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. And it is so important that we analyse this crisis and put forward solutions as well as building resistance against the Tories. Before I final speak, I'm just going to make a few announcements. Thank you to everyone for participating and watching, over nearly 1,000 people at different points, so probably over 1,000 all in all. Thanks also to Patrick and all the volunteers, Logan and Fraser. Our key message from today is that all those people who are on the march or will be on the march in months ahead against the Tory attacks will have our support, and we will stand with them. We stand with you, and we are here to offer you platforms to keep taking the fight to Boris Johnson and the Tories. And where the Labour front bench won't take the fight to the Tories, we collectively will and must do it anyway. Moving forward, we know just how important our campaigning against the Tories agenda is, and our work in Labour for socialist policies and party democracy remains. We also must support the movements outside of Parliament, such as the People's Assembly, Stand Up to Racism, and the different actions that our other speakers have talked about. Please do also take on board the action links, including by making sure as many people as possible sign the Workers Can't Wait petition. And please, one final plug, do donate £10 or what you can afford. We must build the Tories and popularise our socialist solutions. Let's do it together. Over to our final speaker, John McDonnell.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to all the organisers of tonight's event. When we decided to convene this session, it was with the view that we're within a week of the spring statement. It isn't a full budget, it's a spring statement, but it's, even though it's not a full budget, it's incredibly important. And I actually do think we're at a very critical political moment. So I just thought those speeches tonight were absolutely impressive. I want to address the sort of three questions that people have been raising, really. First of all, what's the reality of the impact of the cost of living crisis we're facing? Second, what are the real causes of the crisis? And then thirdly, what really needs to be done? On the impact of the crisis, if we just look at some hard facts, relatively objective facts produced by the think tanks over the last week or so, the New Economics Foundation has published a report this week which used a new standard to measure living standards based upon need. It's the minimum income standard. It's used to calculate the real living wage. And so the New Economics Foundation report identified 23.4 million people living below the basic minimum income standard, effectively below the cost of living just to survive. And on average, they were missing out that standard by about £9,000 a year. NEF is proposing a new social security system, which is based upon a living income, setting an income floor, whether you're in work or out of work. Alongside that, again, some of this is irrefutable now. The Resolution Foundation, its recent report described the defining economic feature of 2022 as the major hit on living standards for households, and driven by high and rising inflation. In addition to the immediate impact of rising inflation and the war in Ukraine, the report also pointed out something we've discussed before, which is
the weak productivity growth as posing the longer term threat to people's living standards. It's interesting, the Resolution Foundation said, and this is why over this next week in the arguments that we're going to have, we need to get across to people these hard facts. Inflation is the highest rate in 30 years. And the prospect of inflation now is 8% plus. And it always hits the poorest harder, particularly because those poorest households spend 3 times the average on energy. And the foundation, the Resolution Foundation also highlights the fact that real wages are failing to compete pace with inflation. We know that, but also the value of benefits and pensions is falling as a result of the 3.1% rise the government awarded pensions and benefits, something that we, unfortunately, the Labour front bench abstained on, but we voted against because it's a benefits cut, it's a pension cut. And it's the equivalent, the Resolution Foundation has calculated now that that was the equivalent of a £10 billion cut in benefits. That's why we voted against, and we were right to. Of course, and as Diane and others have said, you add to that the national insurance and the council tax rises, the increase in rent and mortgage costs, and what the Resolution Foundation described as the incomes recession. And it's on a scale that we've only seen in the recessions of the mid-1970s and the early 1980s. So yes, there is a real cost of living crisis. It's certain to get worse unless the government steps in. But every time the government has stepped in, it's made matters worse. It's cancelled the protective triple lock on pensions. It's put up rail fares. It's inflicted cuts in benefits below the rate of inflation. It's cut wages by imposing below inflation pay settlements. And if you want one of the examples of that over the last month, the offer to council workers is 1.75% increase in pay when inflation will be at 8%. And then, of course, tax rises, the tax rises of national insurance and council tax are just coming in when inflation is beginning to peak. So let's talk about what are the real causes of the cost of living crisis is. Diane's right, of course, the immediate causes are the impact of the pandemic on supply chains, forcing up price inflation, especially energy prices, but also foodstuffs are increasing in cost as well. And yes, of course, the implications of the tragedy of the war in Ukraine. But these are the immediate causes, but we need to highlight there are much longer term causes that stretch back over the last 40 years, back to the 1980s. The cost of living crisis has been a long-term brewing, and it's at the heart of neoliberalism. The dominance of neoliberal economic model has meant that the market diktat of short-term profiteering has dominated our economy rather than the long-term planned investment that we needed. And it's a model that's transformed our economy from production to financialized rent seeking. An economy fueled by and dependent on cheap fossil fuels, heedless of the environmental risk, an economy that's reliant on cheapening the cost of labor by the imposition of anti-trade union laws, casualization, privatization, outsourcing, offshoring, and of course, straightforward imposition of wage cuts and wage freezes over the last 12 years of austerity. So after 40 years of neoliberal dominance, most people just don't have the financial resilience to cope with the cost of living hit they're now experiencing. If you add to that, it's meant that people have been ripped off by profiteering energy companies for years. And at the same time, alternative energy sources have been limited by the lack of investment on the scale needed. Energy usage and demand is at high levels also because there's been a lack of planned investment in insulation and energy conservation. So actually it is time, I think it's time for some hard lessons to be learned and for some radical action to halt and reverse the disastrous economic strategy of the last 40 years that we've depicted as neoliberalism. So the third question then is what really needs to be done? And there's been some fantastic speeches tonight setting it out. I just want to make this point, and it's as much a message to Our colleagues on the Labour front bench at the moment and elsewhere, this is no time for half-hearted measures. No time for half-hearted measures. We need a radical recovery programme, radical action to increase incomes, control prices, control rents, and yes, invest in sustainable green growth, insulation, energy conservation, and alternative renewable energy sourcing. Let's just go through those points. On increase incomes, how do we increase incomes? First of all, we stand by those fighting for a real pay rise. We demand that every worker gets at least an inflation-proof pay rise. We support every strike and by joining our local picket lines when people are fighting for a real pay rise. And as John Hendy has said very clearly, we continue our demand that Labour maintains its commitment to restoration of collective sectoral bargaining to protect workers themselves. On pensions, you know, every Conservative MP and Labour MP stood on a manifesto promising to maintain the triple lock on pensions. And then at the end of the last year, the Conservatives voted to scrap the triple lock. But unfortunately, again, Labour abstained and they whipped the Labour MPs to abstain. I voted against, and so did Diane and many of our fellow campaign group colleague MPs. And why did we do that? It's because there are already 2 million pensioners living in poverty. And yet the government legislated to get rid of the triple lock because their fear was inflation would reach 6% and that would be reflected in the pension rise. Well, actually, it's going to reach 8% and it's needed. That triple lock is needed more than ever. On benefits, inflation is already rising at more than 5%. It's going to be 8% likely. But the government's up rating of 3.1% means a real terms cut for millions of disabled people, unemployed workers, family carers, and others. Let's get across to the Labour front bench and all those who will listen to us. All benefits and pensions need to be uprated by 8%, where inflation is forecast to peak. And we should immediately restore the £20 universal credit uplift and extend that to those on legacy benefits, the employment and support allowance. The government, actually, we've got to demand, should cancel the national insurance rise and the council tax increases, and instead simply find the money, making sure we align capital gains tax rates with income tax so that we tax wealth at the same way we tax income from work. Calculation by the TUC, it would raise £17 billion. Let's just go on to price controls, because I think we do need to start having a discussion about the need for a programme of price controls. Yes, we start with energy costs. Household energy bills were already set to increase by £700 before Russia started the current war in Ukraine. That was an increase of nearly 50%. The government is now briefing that people should expect another sharp increase in the energy bill price cap in October. What this country needs is not a rise in the price cap, but the introduction of a profit cap. The Commonwealth, the left think tank published today is showing research that demonstrates the profit margin for electricity in the UK, the profit margin is 42.5% for electricity. For gas, it's 40.5%. Do you know where energy is publicly owned, and talking to Kat Hobbs and others who'll explain in more detail, where it is publicly owned and regulated, as in France, energy bills aren't going up by 50%, but by 4%. Ironically, the French energy company, EDF, makes some of its profits from the UK's privatised energy market. It's madness. So the government must act to cap bills now, and there's no better time. There's no better time to actually now win the argument for nationalisation of the energy sector, so it's run for the people, not for profit. The government also, obviously, we've argued before and others have raised it tonight, we should look for the doubling of the winter fuel allowance for pensioner households and extending the allowance to all those on universal credit and legacy benefits. And we have to cap other costs wherever we can, and especially where that matches our climate commitments too. So I actually welcome Andy Burnham's victory in regulating the buses in Greater Manchester, as he gets control of capping bus fares at At the moment, it's suggesting £2 for an adult and child fares at £1. We should be looking now at how we progress a programme of price controls right the way across our society. And that just leads me on to rent controls. In many parts of the country, the largest single expense is housing costs, especially for those in the private rented sector. Last October, ahead of the beginning of this spending review, I called for a rent freeze for everybody. Well, I'm pleased. People derided it at the time, but I'm pleased actually to see Sadiq Khan in London now is calling for a rent freeze in London. And I think what we've got to do is escalate that demand up. We also obviously need to scrap the benefit cap. It's causing social cleansing in our cities. And of course, we need to be building a mass program of council housing. Zero carbon council housing is what we could build to help us house people, but also tackle the climate change threat. And again, I just pay tribute to all those who are campaigning in this field, Acorn, the London Renters Union, and Living Rent in Scotland, who are doing a fantastic job of representing tenants and housing campaigners. Final point then is about investing in green growth. I think it's a no-brainer. Unemployment is low, but wages are falling. Too many jobs are insecure and low paid. And we have a climate crisis, a cost of living crisis, and a housing crisis. And the government's response is to leave it to the market. So in the 2019 election, Becky Long-Bailey launched the Warm Homes programme. It was an initiative to insulate 27 million homes, create over 400,000 jobs, reduce bills and save lives. It was a brilliant programme. We need to swing behind it now. And we need to, as Kat and others have said, it's about investing in publicly owned wind, wave and solar power, creating a domestic supply chain of good jobs here in the UK. And that does mean, taking on the challenge of land ownership as well, and using land value taxation if necessary to ensure that we have a fair taxation system, but also so that we have environmental controls over land more effectively in the future. Let me just conclude then. My view is this, and it echoes what others have said. I think emergency situations like this demand radical action. I think we need a radical recovery program that increases incomes, controls prices and rents, and invests to grow green on a scale we've never seen before. In every other period, let me just explain this, because I just think this is a key political moment for all of us. In every other period of history, when inflation combines with wage cuts and people struggle to pay for the basics in life, when they confront a real cost of living crisis, that's when people get angry. That's when people demand change. It's when they see the system is failing them, and it's when they demand real change and are increasingly open to radical change. So I think we have an opportunity. In fact, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to offer that radical change and to act to bring it about. And my final words are these. I don't think we should underestimate the political potential of this moment for radical change, because that's what people will be demanding of it. And what we've got to do is be there, supporting all those in the struggle for that radical change. And yes, ensuring that we do everything we possibly can to offer leadership for that movement. Solidarity.
Thank you, John. And that brings us to a close today. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and great to see such great numbers. See you all soon. Please continue to support the petition and our work. Thank you.